drivetrain technology has defined Audi so considerably. I simply like the idea of developing a vision for a car in a form that didn't yet exist at that time, and to show the world that we could do it better. The all-wheel drive idea made automotive history for Audi. To learn more about the birth of quattro technology, we travelled to Hamelin in the German state of Lower Saxony. Here, in a small industrial town, lives the man who 35 years ago was head of pre-development at Audi and the originator of quattro drive technology. In Ingolstadt, the head of chassis development comes to Walter Tresser and raves about the great handling of a VW Iltis, an off-road vehicle. He made the offhand comment that if we had the Iltis with more engine power, we would outshine all the rest. That was his vision, to have an Iltis that would have superior driving characteristics in snow. I was more of the opinion that we should make a sporty passenger car, a coupe, a two-seater or a 2+2, great performance and four-wheel drive. And then I won out in the end with my idea. In February 1977, Tresser and his 12-man team began to develop the first Audi with permanent all-wheel drive. 6 months later, in November 1977, the first Audi Quattro is finished, the UR Quattro. In-house, the car is called the A1. The A stands for all-wheel, the 1 for the first all-wheel model. The car is a modified Audi 80 with slightly lengthened wheelbase and a 5-cylinder turbocharged engine with 200 horsepower. Walter Tresser and his colleagues clock up lots of test drive kilometers before presenting the new driveline technology to Ferdinand Piëch, the chief technical executive with overall responsibility for the project. Piëch was behind the wheel at one of our first prototypes, and when the car came to a stop at the Turascher Hohe mountain pass, local people were there fitting snow chains. And then, while assembling the snow chains, the locals kept glancing at the Quattro with its summer tires with expressions of pity on their faces. They fitted snow chains, and then Piëch just sped off with summer tires through the swirling snow. The all-wheel drive in the UR Quattro impresses and passes all internal tests. Now, all that remains is to choose a name for the new drivetrain. I tried the whole time to find a name that was not just a name, but more a type of classification. And then we came up with Quattro with 2 T's and an R that rolled off the tongue much better. But the Audi marketing department in Wolfsburg was pushing for the name Characterize. Before that, I had heard about this perfume from 4711, a simple cologne for women. When the name Characterize was presented in this meeting, I said, surely you don't want to name this beautiful car after an ordinary woman's cologne. I showed them the bottle. That didn't make me any friends, but in the end it helped make sure that Quattro won out.
Natürlich keine Freunde gebracht, aber am Ende geholfen, das Quattro durchzusetzen.
Walter Tresser prevails for the second time, and as a result, the Audi Quattro with permanent all-wheel drive made its world premiere in March 1980 at the Geneva Motor Show. While the all-wheel drive technology goes into series production, Walter Tresser moves to motorsport, along with his all-wheel concept. Here too, the success stories come quickly. In 1981, Franz Wittmann wins the Jana Rally in Austria, more than 20 minutes ahead of the competing cars. This lead and this appearance was all it took to focus the attention of the entire rally world on Quattro and on the four-wheel concept. Today, there's not a single rally car without all-wheel drive. The spotlight also falls on Tresser when the French driver Michel Mouton agrees to join his factory team. The first woman in the history of rally racing. With Mouton, he wins the San Remo Rally. From a technological standpoint, the Audi with all-wheel drive is at least 2 years ahead of the competition. And in 1984, it attracts the rally racing legend Walter Röhrl to the Audi factory team. Everyone wants to drive the most successful car in rally racing history and score victories with the Quattro technology. After amassing over 20 wins, Audi withdraw from rally racing in 1986. By then, Walter Tresser had also departed, leaving Audi to start his own business. Today, he runs a small fan club where he's gathered memories and vehicles from his career. Walter Tresser had an idea that enabled him to redefine Audi drive technology, and it's still decisively shaping driving dynamics today.
"40 years of Quattro in the Audi Museum Mobile in Ingolstadt." Dieter Weidemann is one of the people who has spent many years developing drive systems. The special exhibition looks at 40 years of Quattro development. Legendary commercials run on the screens, including the memorable ascent of the ski jump in Finland. I remember it well. It was legendary back in the day. That's when I decided that a career in the automotive industry was for me. I had lots of luck and ended up then in all-wheel drive development. 2 times rally champion Harald Demuth sat in the Audi 100 CS Quattro back then, missed the ski jump, and the Quattro developer want to experience 40 years of development today. Basically, we used to develop things using trial and error in the old days. There was no one to ask because no one had any experience of turbocharged engines or four-wheel drive. The test track in Neuburg an der Donau will see the direct comparison with today's Audi S5. The permanent four-wheel drive with center and rear differential lock, which you could switch between mechanically by hand, was groundbreaking in the 80s Quattro. 200 horsepower was phenomenal back in the day. A Porsche or Ferrari might have been more powerful, but the way in which the Quattro drive put the power on the road, there was nothing like it. You didn't have to meter the acceleration the way you did with other vehicles. You could simply press the accelerator and the car had traction, whatever the situation. That's what still fascinates me even today. The Quattro was constantly improved over the years. In particular, its all-wheel drive system was fine-tuned with a self-locking center differential in 1986. The basic torque split remained 50-50. Inside the center differential on a modern-day Audi S5, the torque split is intentionally unequal. And a few years ago we switched to a different basic split, moving more towards 40-60. This here is a one-to-one original center differential that we fitted in the S5. You can see just how small it actually is, and that the gears inside transfer the entire torque for both axles. This makes the traction even better and redistributes the power and the torque efficiently and homogeneously. Cornering becomes even more precise and more dynamic. 40 years of successful all-wheel drive development, from the original Quattro to the present day.
We are here now at the Audi Driving Experience Center in Neuburg. And we're using our proving ground to show you the technology of electric torque vectoring. In electric torque vectoring, we are not only able to improve the vehicle's agility, moreover, we have the possibility to set a new benchmark regarding traction and vehicle stability. In an open differential, the torque of the wheel with the lower friction determines the force that is applied to the other wheel. On the rear axle, where we don't have this mechanical connection between the left and the right rear wheel, we can totally independent shift the torque and use the maximum of traction for the driver. Yeah, we're just using the track to show you how the technology works. That function can be applied directly to normal road surfaces. Imagine a very icy road, imagine a wet road. Electric torque vectoring always gives you a maximum of traction and stability in every situation. So let's take a deeper look how that works in reality. Therefore, we are here on our track, on our off-road parcours. And if we look on the front axle, we see the wheel with the open differential, it's just spinning. Now let's take a deeper look on the rear axle, which is very interesting. Electric torque vectoring helps us. The wheel is standing, you're shifting all the torque to the other side, which gives the customer a maximum of traction, and that is Quattro.
We are here on a climbing hill at our test site where we are recreating extreme situations in which we test the all-wheel drive. Having already carried out the tuning, defined the locking values and done the road testing with regards to handling, we also need to check whether the part also holds up in extreme customer situations. We take the vehicle with the most powerful engine variant, the greatest output and the most torque. We take tires with the largest rims and the least rubber so that it contains few damping elements. We drive in the sharpest drive select mode and disable the ESC completely. Put simply, we always want to cover the absolute worst case scenario in our testing. Therefore, first we measure the weight including the driver and then we load the car up to the permissible gross vehicle weight. In this case, we have loaded it with 25 sacks weighing 20 kilograms each. So in total we have 500 kilograms plus the driver, meaning that we are absolutely at the limits of what is permissible. Here we have an installation where tiled areas repeatedly alternate with asphalt, with a very high amount of grip. This installation is then watered. That enables us to simulate frequently driving on sheets of ice even during summer operations. We start the test with the rear axle on tiles and the front axle on rough asphalt. And then we perform launch control drives in order to subject the rear axle to the maximum load. It is very heavily loaded and then suddenly comes from the patch of ice onto the asphalt and experiences very high torque peaks accordingly. And if my rear axle is on ice, all of the torque that I need to get this heavy vehicle up the mountain must be distributed over a single axle. This means that the center differential needs to distribute the torque and balance out the rotational speeds with a full engine load all at the same time. Of course, that is an extreme load for this part, but it must be able to do it and must not suffer any damage. To conclude the test, we then drive over the entire patchwork quilt of ice and asphalt with full load acceleration. That results in very heavy impacts throughout the powertrain. But no damage is permissible there either. The benefits to the customer are that their center differential will never go to pieces and also that the rest of the drive will hold up for 300,000 kilometers or more. The claims for damage from the field are virtually zero and also show that we are right to take this approach. It is simply important to test the parts in extreme situations to ensure that they will also last forever.
It is 1980, March, the Geneva Salon d'Automobile, and the world is looking at Audi, and it's looking at this car, the Audi Quattro. It was absolutely revolutionary to have the idea at that time to have all four wheels powered, not just like an off-roader. No, this technology was also to be rolled out in a very normal car. Well, a very normal car is this Audi Quattro, of course not, with its 200 PS strong 5-cylinder turbo engine and for the first time with a permanent all-wheel drive system on board for serial production. The Audi was already then synonymous for Vorsprung durch Technik. How we had the legendary all-wheel drive system fine-tuned over the last 40 years and what role it plays, and especially the central mid-diff, and how acribic our engineers to this day have been honing the Quattro day in, day out. That is something we will be talking about today in this Tech Talk. And with that, welcome to the Audi TechTalk Quattro, the success technology.
Audi quattro.
Si s'avance.
Well, I think that clip made it quite clear that Audi's Quattro and Quattro is indeed Audi. There's hardly a technology in the automotive industry that has shaped the image of a brand as much as Quattro has shaped Audi. So, dear colleagues, as always in our Tech Talk, we also have split this one up into two parts. The first 25 minutes, roughly, will be dedicated to giving you an overview on the development of the Quattro technology over the last 40 years. To be followed then by the possibility to enter into the Q&A session to chat with you directly. And you can send us your questions using that chat question already during the 25-minute presentation. We'll come back to that question later. And of course, otherwise, we do look forward to hearing it directly from you in the Q&A session in audio and video signal here in the studio. Now, I've got with me two colleagues here who really have Quattro in their blood. They are really milestones in the Quattro development, Dieter Weidemann and William Weitz.
Hello, Eva. Hello, Eva.
Hello, the two of you. Well, both of you have been for over 20 years with Audi, and almost all that time you've been working on the Quattro issues. Quite honestly, do I really need all-wheel drive trains in everyday situation if I'm not going off-road or pulling heavy loads? Well, needing, says Dieter, is of course such a thing. I mean, normally I'll reach most destinations with a classic car, but there's plenty of drive situations when all-wheel drive system offers you clear advantages. And there's far more than you would have thought of, and they're not just limited to off-road situations, but also everyday conditions where all-wheel drive, and especially a Quattro, offers you added value. Indeed, it's quite right what Dieter says there. And of course, I mean, if you think the cars have become stronger and stronger in the last years and bigger, it becomes more tricky to put all that torque onto the road just using one axle, and two powered axles are simply an advantage here. I mean, and it also, of course, when you just corner on a dry road, if you really go with great speed into the motorway, for example, then with a Quattro, that's no problem whatsoever. But with a front-wheel drive, you can easily encounter spin there. Now, before we look in detail at all these things of distribution of torque and the likes, I mean, Dieter, you a few weeks ago went back on a kind of a time travel, and you were assisted by the two-time rally champion for Germany, Harald Demuth.
40 years of Quattro in the Audi Museum Mobile in Ingolstadt. Dieter Weidemann is one of the people who has spent many years developing drive systems. The special exhibition looks at 40 years of Quattro development. Legendary commercials run on the screens, including the memorable ascent of the ski jump in Finland.
I remember it well. It was legendary back in the day. That's when I decided that a career in the automotive industry was for me. I had lots of luck and ended up then in all-wheel drive development.
2 times rally champion Harald Demuth sat in the Audi 100 CS Quattro back then, missed the ski jump, and the Quattro developer want to experience 40 years of development today. Basically, we used to develop things using trial and error in the old days. There was no one to ask because no one had any experience of turbocharged engines or four-wheel drive. The test track in Neuburg an der Donau will see the direct comparison with today's Audi S5. Permanent four-wheel drive with center and rear differential lock, which you could switch between mechanically by hand, was groundbreaking in the 80s Quattro. 200 horsepower was phenomenal back in the day. A Porsche or Ferrari might have been more powerful, but the way in which the Quattro drive put the power on the road, there was nothing like it. You didn't have to meter the acceleration the way you did with other vehicles. You could simply press the accelerator and the car had traction, whatever the situation. That's what still fascinates me even today. The Quattro was constantly improved over the years. In particular, its all-wheel drive system was fine-tuned with a self-locking center differential in 1986. The basic torque split remained 50-50. Inside the center differential on a modern-day Audi S5, the torque split is intentionally unequal.
And a few years ago, we switched to a different basic split, moving more towards 40/60. This here is a 1-to-1 original center differential that we fitted in the S5. You can see just how small it actually is, and that the gears inside transfer the entire torque for both axles. This makes the traction even better and redistributes the power and the torque efficiently and homogeneously. Cornering becomes even more precise and more dynamic. 40 years of successful all-wheel drive development, from the original Quattro to the present day.
Well, Dieter Harald Demuth already mentioned it in the clip. How do you get the torque onto the road? That was at the time quite unique. Now, how you see the Audi Quattro with an open diff that was manually locked in comparison to an S5 of today with the last iteration of our self-locking mid-diff. Well, I think you would have to go a little further back here, because the idea for the Quattro, of course, was also born from the fact that in the winter test drives, a Volkswagen Iltis with an all-wheel drive system proved to be clearly better in traction than over the, big engined vehicles, also at the winter testing. And of course, that was progenitor of the idea that we should combine the best of both worlds, an all-wheel drive system with a good traction and with an engine with the corresponding performance. Which also means, of course, that a technical solution for the archaic, for the first Quattro, was pretty close to the solution found for the Iltis, and was more focused on traction than anything else. Meaning, it was an open diff, and of course, you need the diff, first of all, to have the torque leveling in cornering between front and rear axle, but of course, also has the disadvantage, if I've got an open diff, that moment where I can put torque to the road, I'm always limited by the one axle that has less traction. And that means I can only put that much torque on the other axle, then that has the lower traction. And therefore, and that's also the case to this day in off-road segment cars. You've got these full differentials that simply block that torque leveling, which means on an off-road condition, I've got super traction and all the advantages, but of course got other disadvantages. For example, when parking, I've got a tensioning of the vehicle that is not really suited to a passenger vehicle. And also the brake control systems that started in the 80s were not compatible with a fully locking mid-diff. And so, as of the middle of the 80s, one started to come up with different technical solutions. That is the self-locking mid-diffs. And you see, these mid-diffs here, for example, the self-locking one, that's actually one of the first ones, the torsion type A. They have a kind of an internal locking mechanism. Now, what they all have in common is that the transfer of the torque is done by the helix gearing into axial forces, and with that you have a friction created inside the mid-diff. And so this is how I can bring traction to the axle with a better traction than to the one with a lower traction, which means traction improves, but at the same time I also have this leveling effect in the diff, which means in cornering I also can actually go round the bend without having the car tensioning up. And so over the course of time, the self-locking mid-diffs have seen iterations of improvements. The torsion A focus was very much still on traction, and then, as you see here with the torsion B, the focus was more on making sure that the tensioning during cornering was to be reduced. In torsion type C, that was actually the first solution where we had a 40/60 torque split, the basic torque split, that was more geared towards drive dynamics, and with torsion CSM that we have at the moment in serial car production. That's really a combination of all of it, a super traction, great drive dynamics, and at the same time, as you see here, a very compact and small build. So that if you take a look at these four, we've really cut the weight, we've saved a lot of weight by the use of special materials, and have really, achieved quite a bit of efficiency with that. William, speaking quite generally, what's the characteristic features that an Audi with a quattro powertrain shall always bring or show? Well, speaking quite generally, it should simply be easy to drive. every customer, also those who are not, so to say, rally drivers, should feel comfortable in the winter on snow and on ice. So the car should not have too much understeer, it should not have too much oversteer, and if it ever should oversteer gently, that shall feel comfortable and should be a gradual oversteering so that a customer can actually react. Now, Dieter just said, up until about 2005, you had the 50-50 torque split between front and rear axle, so equal torque going to the front and to the rear axle. How did you come to actually take that step to a 40-60 torque split? Answer, well, with a 50-50 torque split, there's a bit of a disadvantage that you need to consider. If you accelerate in the corner, you never quite exactly know, is the car going to understeer or is it going to oversteer? And when you have a torque split that's quite clear, that is a little less at the front, a little more at the back here, then the consequence is that the car always has a very neutral or a slightly oversteering reaction, which on snow and ice is simply the much better drive behavior. And for the customer then, predictable, indeed, very predictable and easy to drive for the driver or the customer. With the old system, of course, if you had a bit of exercise, you could get used to it so that it also was predictable, but this is, I mean, only for customers who are not so often on snow and ice. Dieter, let's go back to the component level. How did you achieve that basic torque split of 40 to 60? Well, I can show you this here by the mid-diff that we currently have in the S5, how that basic torque split is achieved. Now, what you see here is a 3D cutaway model, and if you look at it from the front here, that's what it would look like. So, we've got a power shaft that propels here the mid-diff. That's the power direction. And it then takes along these planetary gears shown here in red. And the planetary gears, as you can see here, then propel two different gears. That's the ring gear here on the outside, and that's the power takeoff to the rear axle. And on the inside, that's here, that's the sun gear, that's where they go to the front axle. Meaning, I've got different lever effects. So if I go from the center to the front axle and then to the rear axle power takeoff, you can see this is exactly this split 60 to 40, meaning a long lever to the rear axle, 60%, meaning more torque, and 40% less torque going to the front axle. And that's the basic torque split that we've achieved here, simply given by the geometric setup of the mid-diff. And we can also have a look at this in a technical animation that should make this even clearer yet. Yes, indeed. Here you can see the basic distribution is just one element, the 60-40 torque split, and this is really only, well, applicable if both axles go at the same speed. The moment that one axle has less traction on the road, then that torque instantly will be shifted to the other axle with more traction on the road. So up to 70% can go to the front axle, and up to 85% of torque can go to the rear axle. So, the 40-60 split is a geometric basic condition, and as William said, means you've got this predictable and reliable behavior that you always know how the car behaves, but of course in real drive situations, I've got a pretty wide range of torque distribution between front and rear axle. So from theory to practice, it's always a lot of, well, fine-tuning and setup work, isn't it? I mean, that's a huge element of your daily work. And Dieter, you brought some film material from your private stock with you, because you spend a lot of time in Sweden where you test on low-friction surfaces. Maybe you can tell us a little what you do and how you approach this when you go to Sweden. You're quite right. I mean, there's a lot of manual work that we actually do there in Sweden. What we do is, over the course of a year, we have a number of prototypes of new mid-diffs that we develop and that we then build, with different friction discs that we then want to test out, or different helix angles that we want to test out. And we take all of this along with us to Sweden to the winter testing. And in these test conditions, we always have two identical cars with us. One of them becomes our referential car, and the other one becomes our test car. And in these cars, we will then install, well, first of all, actually, we drive them with what they have per serial production. with all electronic control systems deactivated, so that we simply have a mechanical reaction from the car, and also during the entire setup work, we keep all these electronic control systems deactivated. And then, in the one car, we keep the serial mid-diff, and in the other one, we then step by step work our way through the various prototypes until we come to a point where we say we now have a vehicle behavior that we actually prefer over the serial mid-diff. Then the new one becomes our referential car, and then we gradually work our way through these various prototypes, and thus in iterations we try to optimize over the course of the days and to get a better drive behavior. When I say we, of course, it's just the two of you, or it's quite a few of you. But William, tell me, what's it like for you at the end of the day? I think, after you've clocked up miles and miles of testing, are you always fully in agreement, or do you also part company, shall we say, and say, oh, come on, let's sleep over this, and we'll decide what we think on the next day? Well, look, of course, we have plenty of discussions during the course of the day, because, of course, we drive the cars one after the other. So our two cars, we take them on the same track, we change after each lap, and then, of course, there are times where we think, we're not quite in agreement how the car behaves. And then we discuss it. Sometimes we even drive together another lap to make sure that we really are in agreement. But, of course, you often find that also in the cross-country roads that are not just on frozen lakes, but also in rural areas. They can be 20 kilometers in length, and it could well be that a truck or whatever goes ahead of you and, of course, changes the road surface conditions. And then, of course, you probably feel different from what your colleague felt at that same section. So we talk over it for as long until we have an agreement. And when we part company, we are always of one opinion. Yes, you're right. Up to now, we've always managed. Now, in that clip, we saw an A4 saloon. But, of course, that self-locking mid is also used in a Q8. And now, of course, a Q8, from a drive dynamics, it's a big SUV. It's quite different from an A4 mid-segment saloon. So how does this work? That is still much the same behavior. Answer being, well, look, the reason why we take a smaller car, an A4 saloon, is because it's usually lighter and can react a little faster to, well, outside interferences, and also reacts faster in changes to its all-wheel drive system. The advantage of our MLB, of our longitudinal matrix, is, of course, that all these cars have a pretty similar axle load distribution, and also the axle setup is pretty similar. And so, thank God, they also react pretty much akin to changes in the torsion mid-diff. So if we have something in the S5 and then fit it to a Q8 or Q7, there's also a good mid-diff. So we take our two referential cars and also often, well, take that mid-diff, the prototype mid-diff, and put it into an SQ7 or SQ8 that we have with us in Sweden. And always, well, have a kind of iteration fitted to the bigger cars. And the changes we've noticed in the smaller cars often hold equally true for the bigger cars. Of course, sometimes not so pronounced, because, of course, that the reaction is a bit more latent. But what happened in the small car and what's good in the small car is also good for the bigger cars. Yes, the big advantage of the mid-diff is, of course, if it's, well, holistically fine-tuned with its kind of locking ratings, if it's a homogeneous unit in itself. And as William said, we find what's very good in the one car is actually also very good and the best in the other car, so we don't have to make any compromises here. Once you've done your testing in Sweden, you take that final state of the mid-diff and test them on high-friction tracks. Here, the Nürburgring is a vitally important area. How important is the Nürburgring actually for you then? Well, look, the Nürburgring is actually important for us because it really puts the entire all-wheel drive system through its paces. Because here, at a very short time, we've got different conditions with great centrifugal forces, lots of longitudinal acceleration, top speeds, top heat development, and here we can really test the entire all-wheel system. For example, the temperatures. How can we handle the temperatures? And of course, also ventilation, lubrication is what it should be. And here, we can also reproduce the situation very quickly at shortest possible time and create situations that would normally only appear, well, as a one-off. So the setup of the mid-diff is something that we always do on low friction surfaces, because here we can really feel the finities much better. Then one of the last stations is close here to Ingolstadt on your internal test track, the so-called misuse testing. Now, this misuse testing is an absolute extreme situation where both car and powertrain really have to prove their mettle. And we'll have a look at this here.
We are here on a climbing hill at our test site where we are recreating extreme situations in which we test the all-wheel drive. Having already carried out the tuning, defined the locking values and done the road testing with regards to handling, we also need to check whether the part also holds up in extreme customer situations. We take the vehicle with the most powerful engine variant, the greatest output and the most torque. We take tires with the largest rims and the least rubber so that it contains few damping elements. We drive in the sharpest drive select mode and disable the ESC completely. Put simply, we always want to cover the absolute worst case scenario in our testing. Therefore, first we measure the weight including the driver and then we load the car up to the permissible gross vehicle weight. In this case, we have loaded it with 25 sacks weighing 20 kilograms each. So in total we have 500 kilograms plus the driver, meaning that we are absolutely at the limits of what is permissible. Here we have an installation where tiled areas repeatedly alternate with asphalt, with a very high amount of grip. This installation is then watered. That enables us to simulate frequently driving on sheets of ice even during summer operations. We start the test with the rear axle on tiles and the front axle on rough asphalt. And then we perform launch control drives in order to subject the rear axle to the maximum load. It is very heavily loaded and then suddenly comes from the patch of ice onto the asphalt and experiences very high torque peaks accordingly. And if my rear axle is on ice, all of the torque that I need to get this heavy vehicle up the mountain must be distributed over a single axle. This means that the center differential needs to distribute the torque and balance out the rotational speeds with a full engine load all at the same time. Of course, that is an extreme load for this part, but it must be able to do it and must not suffer any damage. To conclude the test, we then drive over the entire patchwork quilt of ice and asphalt with full load acceleration. That results in very heavy impacts throughout the powertrain. But no damage is permissible there either. The benefits to the customer are that their center differential will never go to pieces and also that the rest of the drive will hold up for 300,000 kilometers or more. The claims for damage from the field are virtually zero and also show that we are right to take this approach. It is simply important to test the parts in extreme situations to ensure that they will also last forever.
Well, William, these sudden, unforeseeable changes in the traction on the road are, thank God, most of us, well, unknown to most of us. But do you still have a good example for everyday situations where you would encounter that? Well, answer being, what's very typical in winter in the mountains is that during the day, the ice can melt and run over the tarmac, and then you often have this 1 meter long or wide patch that freezes over at night. And, for example, you think it's a dry road and you come out of a corner and suddenly you find yourself for a meter on ice, and that's where you have these similar disruptions in traction on the road. Another example would be if you tow a boat out of water, and I mean with your tow trailer, then you will find that often the rear axle is underwater on slippery surfaces, and here the jetty, and they also have huge friction changes between front and rear axle, and therefore, of course, great changes in torque between front and rear axle. Dieter, currently you're working on the next evolutionary stage of the self-locking mid-diff. Where are you right now, and what are the development targets for you? Well, principally speaking, we're in the midst of that next stage, shall we say halfway through it, of the time that we still need until we have it ready for serial production. And of course, I mean, these iterations and these progressions become smaller and smaller. We've already squeezed out all and most of the potential, but of course, we still wanted to improve. And so in the next stage, we will see a another fine-tuning of the mid-diff when it comes to drive dynamics, but also another weight reduction. We will shed another 10% from the components, and at the same time, we also have increased here rigidity, and that can also handle even bigger engines. Weight is, of course, a good keyword, because you would normally think that all-wheel drive systems always means more weight as you have more components, and thus consequently also greater fuel consumption. So how important is efficiency for you? Well, look, of course, efficiency is something that we need to and will consider, and it's true that an all-wheel drive has more components. Yes, indeed. But we are working on this for decades already, and we are trying to make all the individual components as efficient as possible. Looking at the material, with many casings coming already in aluminum, but also, for example, lubrication is something that is now very, very pinpointed, that you don't have any leakage here, and that you run as often as possible dry, or you have any bodies inside, so that the oil lubrication is only there where it's needed, and all the other parts can run, as I say, as dry as possible. So these are elements or bearings that you make more efficient. So a lot of work has gone into this, so that every little nut and cranny is already highly efficient and optimized to efficiency. But of course, we still consider whether we can still squeeze out a little more. So some you spend a lot of love and put a lot of love and detail into the system to get out that last drop. The normal customer will probably hardly notice that, and or can, well, experience in driving. So what's the key advantage, William, for Quattro? Well, over the years, of course, I mean, these little iterations have amassed to a bigger leap forward. And it's still our objective, of course, that the car should be easy to handle. And it is, of course, becoming more and more fun to drive. It's easy, comfortable, and it's also enjoyable to drive. And that's something customers are noticing. Well, thanks to the two of you, Dieter and William. And I think one thing has become clear. Quattro defines Vorsprung back then, today, and also in the future. From strong traction to enormous drive dynamics, all the way through to the best possible efficiency. And efficiency, by the way, is a good catchword, because we already just teased at that already. This week, we'll drill that efficiency topic a little deeper, because as of tomorrow, we will look at Quattro with ultra technology and with our electric Quattro with the torque vectoring on the rear act. I look forward to maybe seeing and hearing from you again this week. Otherwise, stay healthy and stay tuned. Goodbye.